All right, folks, I'm going to get started. All right, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back, all of you that decided to show up today, which is really great. It reflects really well on who you are. Not that the rest of the people that aren't here are terrible people, but obviously you were willing to make the effort to come to class, which, of course, is always appreciated. But again, is about how it benefits you and how it reflects upon who you are and your dedication to what you're doing, and that is admirable, and good job on that. So here we are, Econ 161, Introductory Macro. We are on the third week of our meetings, so things are starting to move along. The first exam is in 3 weeks, so slightly far away, but not too far away, so definitely something to start keeping in mind, that an exam is coming and that you should be not falling behind in the material, understanding the things that we cover, so that at the end, when the exams start to roll in and you've got however many and all these other things to do, that you are just reviewing things that we've covered in the class rather than scrambling to cram and learn a bunch of things for the first time like the night before the exam. That is a disaster in the making. All of you know it. You've all gone through it maybe at least once. I have, of course, and it ain't pretty. So definitely put your head in the game now. Spend as much time as you can on doing well in this course, and you will do well in the course. Are there any questions about anything general before I get started with the actual material that I'm going to cover? So I've been told by one of your fellow students that the book has finally arrived at the bookstore. So if you were waiting to buy the actual book from the bookstore, it is there now. It is available. Go get it. But I would assume that most of you have at least registered for the free access to the homework system. So that should hopefully be working out for you. Yes. So we meet on Tuesdays, so yeah, it would be on Sundays. Yeah, I just made those because I wanted to get it as far away from the add drop thing as possible in case there was somebody that was going to add it at the end, and I wanted to give them some time to finish the homework. But yeah, from this point forward, it will be as it was set forth in the syllabus. So the syllabus, again, is the guide for the class. It tells you exactly how everything works. If you have any doubts or questions about anything with respect to the class, check the syllabus first. Yes? When was that? I think, yeah. I checked it like a couple of days ago, and for some reason, the assignments weren't active, so I activated them. So you should be able to see them now for chapter 2 and 3. Those will be due Tuesday, following Tuesday. And then today we'll finish chapter 6, so that one will be due on Tuesday as well. And then beyond that, we'll finish chapter 7 next week, and then that'll be due the following Sunday. Yeah. Other questions? So yeah, we've done chapters 1, 2, and 3. Now we're doing 6 today. We'll start on 7 today. Other questions? Alrighty, then let us get forward with the momentum for the day, dealing with the subject of macroeconomics finally. So we've been introducing you to some basic ideas in chapter 1 that underlie all of economic theory, the approach of economics, what we do, these principles that underline our perspective on things that again underlie everything we do. And then in the next chapter, in chapter 2, we talked about models in general. So again, economics, like most sciences, involves us modeling, creating simplified versions of the world we live in order to understand parts of it or maybe all of it. And so in that chapter, we introduced the production possibility frontier, which was the first model we covered. And then we covered the model of comparative advantage that used the production possibility frontier to establish why there are gains from trade. So we went through this whole big example that I expect you to understand and maybe reproduce as well, potentially. And so that that laid a foundation of understanding of models and our focus on models and how you should be in tune with the models that we use, and just really understand them as thoroughly as possible, because there's a lot of meaning in even the most mundane details of those models. So yeah, and then finally we looked at a circular flow diagram in that chapter, which was just a schematic diagram, a visual representation of a very simplified economy where you had firms and households interacted in two types of markets, which were goods and services markets and the factor markets. Factor markets in economics deal explicitly with the factors of production, those inputs that are used to produce. And generally, it's labor and capital are the two big categories that they fall into. So anyway, we introduced a bunch of stuff in that chapter. So again, make sure you know all of it that we covered and understand it, and the homework and etc. And of course, look at the practice exam, see how I might test you on some of these things that we've covered. And then in chapter 3, we covered the very basic but very important model of supply and demand, right? So that model is like the staple of these courses, and it is a model of a competitive market, which is an example of a market where there's no ability by like single firms or groups of firms to like dominate the market. Everybody kind of just like sells as much as they can within the market. And there's so many sellers that nobody can really affect the price. And so the good that's being sold is considered a generic good, like wheat or oil, things that are just like that you can't make special. You can't make your special brand of. Like they're just like things that anybody can sell if they just like invest in the capital you need to produce these things. So it was a very particular type of market, but this type of market represents some important markets in the economy. So as we move forward in the macro sections of this course, which are this course, we'll see a couple of markets that are really important in sort of understanding the entire economy, and they will function like the supply and demand model that we saw in chapter 3, and that's why it's important to cover that in this class. So make sure you understand that model, all the things, both sides of the market, the forces that shift the curves, what does it mean to be in equilibrium, what happens to equilibrium when curves shift, what happens to the price and the quantity, the equilibrium price and quantity in the market, those sorts of things. Understand those things, know them. There's one open answer question. So the exam, if you looked at it, is made up of 50 multiple choice and 4 open answer questions that might have multiple parts. And there's one in there that deals explicitly with like shifts of curves and how that affects like equilibrium. So definitely it's always important to like really master that one simple model, because it is a go-to as far as like kind of understanding like your basic markets and how they work, even out in the world when when you're away from theory and classes and all this silliness. All right, so anyway, so that's the stuff we've covered so far, and today we're finally going to start introducing the big picture, the reason why we're here, which is macroeconomics, studying the big movements of the economy, not like in micro where you study like individual markets, the decisions of buyers, the decisions of sellers, why a seller might produce a given amount in a particular market. Like these are the big questions that are dealt with in microeconomics. Macroeconomics, not so much. We deal specifically with the big movements of the economy, the ups and downs, the role the government plays, the amount of money that's in the economy, the amount of taxing and spending the government does, interest rates in the economy, inflation, price levels, unemployment, and then the interaction of economies. So just a lot of big sort of topics that are not just important for this class, not just important for business school, but really important in life. Like, you really want to understand these things because they will always affect your life. And even again, if you do not wind up in a business program or anything related to business in the long run, understanding the things that we're going to be talking about in this course will just make you a more knowledgeable person, a better citizen, a more confident person with respect to what's happening in politics, what's happening with our government, what's happening with the economy. The news will talk about this, that, and the other. And if you pay attention in this class, you'll know what they're talking about, and you'll be able to have an intelligent opinion about it, or maybe just understand it yourself intelligently so that you feel confident about your place within it, or how it might affect you, or how it's affecting the rest of the world, and whether or not that's important to you or not. So a lot of things we're going to touch upon here are going to be relevant for the rest of your life. So pay attention. Okay, so first we'll talk about just the overall nature of macroeconomics as a discipline. Then we'll talk about what's called the business cycle, which is like what we term like the ups and downs in the economy. Then we'll talk about long-run economic growth, which is like the increasing ability of the economy to produce. So we talked about economic growth at the beginning of the course, where we talked about how 100 years ago, like, things were dramatically different as far as like our standard of living. Like, people didn't have running water, they didn't have toilets, they didn't have heating, they didn't have electricity, all these things. And through economic growth, we've managed to get to the point we're at now. So the world has dramatically changed because of long-run economic growth. So we'll talk about it just lightly. This chapter is all about sort of introducing the topics that we will cover as we move forward and towards the end of the course. We'll also talk about international imbalances, which have to do with like trade. So countries, they trade with each other, as we talked about in chapter 2 with the comparative advantage model. We saw that like it benefits countries to specialize in the things that they have a comparative advantage in, which means that they have a lower opportunity cost than somebody else. And so if they focus on the things they have a comparative advantage in, then they can produce more of those goods than others, and then trading with others that have comparative advantage in other things will wind up benefiting both countries, or all countries that trade more, in terms of like how much they can produce and consume versus what they could do on their own. So there is a big benefit to trade, and we were able to establish that with a simple model of comparative advantage.
Is this course or future course of economics, as far as the comparative advantages are concerned, getting to contributing factors to that, as far as maybe some of these countries have these comparative advantages because they're doing things that are, they're as far as using child labor,
right,
things of that nature, paying $1 a day kind of thing for labor.
So in this class, we won't talk about that because that's like very specific, and I think that's like a course in and of itself, like to talk about those issues. I think we have a trade course that deals a lot with just like the big theories dealing with trade in general, and I think in that course some of these issues are discussed, and maybe even in other disciplines you might have courses that deal specifically with that. Maybe in some other social science, I don't know. But not specifically in this course, because this course is more about just understanding like, how economists approach like the functioning of the big economy. And again, like a lot of that is about simplifying the world. And so then you can just like zero in on like some of these mechanisms that like help us to trade or whatever. So then we by making simplifications, we aren't able to focus on things like that. So yeah, in this class we won't talk too much about that stuff. But every now and then, if something comes up relating to what we're talking about, yeah, bring it up, and we can have a small discussion about it. But it is about like covering what's in the textbook so that everybody can learn that stuff. And but yeah, all that stuff is super important though. Like there are problems with trade pacts. Like yes, we do have comparative advantages, and it does benefit us to trade. But at what cost does that come? Like are we considering like how workers are being treated in other countries? Are we considering like their standard of living that is allowing them to have a comparative advantage? These are important questions that need to be dealt with in economics. We don't necessarily deal with them explicitly because they're more issues of equity, which is like fairness, and that is like more of the arena of politics rather than economics. But economic theory can help to inform those arguments, and so.
What about currency manipulation? That's not a human rights thing.
Right.
Whereas it does affect the way you trade directly by manipulating that your own.
Right.
For example.
Right, like China, they're keeping their currency low, so people are buying from them.
Is that something that's just going to
We'll touch upon it, like towards the.
More of a general.
Yeah, this is more of like, how does all this stuff work? This is all. Yeah, it's like how do all these things work? Like, so we'll have one chapter on open economy macro where we talk about like trade and we talk about like currencies and like exchange rates and things of that sort. It's at the very end of the course. So we'll lightly talk about these things then, but again, yeah, it is about more just kind of understanding all these big things that are components of the macroeconomy. Yeah. But definitely it is good like to know about the things that we are discussing here, like these other issues that are related to what we're talking about. Like it is good for you to inform yourself about these things, like read books about these things, like read like articles online about some of these issues. Inform yourself about things that may not be explicitly talked about in this course but are connected to this course, because again, it is all about like becoming like that person that really understands the world that you live in, and also just having a position on things, having a position that you can explain and then like discuss with people with respect to how you feel about these important issues. So beyond just the theory we talk about in this course, like use that as like a springboard for yourself to kind of inform yourself of some of these important things that we will sort of lightly touch upon. All right, so that's chapter 6, the introduction of all these things, and then we'll jump into chapter 7, in which we'll start talking about like a specific topic. So once we introduce like the general stuff, then we'll start talking about like the specific things that you need to understand in terms of how the economy works and how the policies work as a result of that, etc. So we'll start talking in chapter 7 about what's called GDP, which is gross domestic product, which is how we measure the total output of an economy, and it is the measure that tells us like what's happening with the economy. Are we doing well? Are we doing bad? GDP is a way of sort of gauging that. It's not a perfect measure, and we have an agency in the government that measures it, and we'll talk about how it's measured. So like you would be expected to understand how it's measured and be able to express your understanding of that. And then we'll also talk about the CPI and tracking both of these are to track the macroeconomy. So the CPI is what's called the Consumer Price Index, and it's how we track the overall level of prices in the economy. So beyond just like the individual price of a good within a specific market that's determined by supply and demand, the overall economy might be causing all prices to go up or all prices to go down. That's called inflation if prices are going up, and deflation if prices are going down. And we have a very specific way of measuring that. It's called the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. So the GDP and CPI are two super central measures that help you to understand how we track the macroeconomy. So we'll begin to talk about that chapter today, and we'll finish that chapter next week. So the national account is how we measure GDP, the gross domestic product. Real GDP is a measure of aggregate output that adjusts for changes in the price level, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. And then finally, price indexes and the aggregate price level have to do with, again, how we measure prices in the overall economy, and we'll get very specific into that. But before we get forward, let's take a couple steps back. So I don't like to, if I have an opportunity, I'd like to kind of just run through some practice problems with you so that you are able to think about like some of the things that we've covered and just kind of think about how you might be tested on them, and So let's do a quick multiple choice problem having to do with the production possibility frontier, the first model we covered in the second chapter that we covered last week. So all points inside the production possibility frontier represent A, efficient production points, B, inefficient production points, C, infeasible production points, or D, economic growth. I'm sorry, I clicked it and I showed you what it was. So let's just go through them. And I was going to poll you, but I'm not going to poll you anymore. Anyway, so yeah, so remember, like we are very specific about the language we use to describe things in our models, and that's meant to help us be able to differentiate one concept from another that may be like, very close to that where like you may have two concepts that are very close to each other in meaning. So you need to be able to differentiate them, so you'll use different language to talk about them. So we talked about the production possibility frontier. In this case, we have this example of just a straight line production possibility frontier. What does the straight line of a production possibility frontier represent? Is constant, right? It's constant along. Now, you're absolutely right. Yes, it is the same as we're moving along it. I also had another example where it was like bowed out. It was like curved out, and that meant that the opportunity cost was increasing. And that was meant to just capture a little bit more of the complexity of life, where in a world where you, let's say, produce only two goods, and let's say you only have so many resources to produce both of those goods, when you try to dedicate all of your resources to producing one good versus another, then you're going to have to rededicate some of the inputs that were made specifically for the other good into production of your second good. So for Dreamliners, which are like big airplanes, and small jets over here. So in this world, only two types of jets are being created: big and small, Dreamliners and small jets. So there's certain machinery, there's certain people that are explicitly meant to produce these large Dreamliners. And so initially, if you are just producing Dreamliners and you want to lower the amount of Dreamliners and produce some small jets, then you're going to dedicate some of your few resources to small jets, and those resources were likely not meant for Dreamliners and for small jets, so there'll be a small opportunity cost there. But as you try to dedicate all of your resources away from Dreamliners, some of which were meant specifically to make Dreamliners, then you have to retrain people. You have to maybe recondition your machinery to be able to produce different things. So that would mean that your opportunity cost, your cost of producing small jets would start to increase. And so then you would see that bowed out shape of the production possibility frontier. But that's not the case here. We just have the straight line, which means the opportunity cost is constant. So we are not including that dimension of complexity in this very simple version of reality that we're working in. So in this very simple version of reality that we're working in, the opportunity cost is constant. So as we move along the production possibility frontier, and we produce less Dreamliners and more small jets, then the opportunity cost is going to be constant in this case. So in this case, you can get the opportunity cost by taking, so let's say the opportunity cost of small jets is going to be measured in Dreamliners. So to produce 40 small jets, you need to give up 30 Dreamliners. So it'll be 30 over 40, so that's 3/4, which means that every small jet costs you 3/4 of a Dreamliner. That's the opportunity cost. We went through how to quantify that last time. Anyway, so that's just some small review of the production possibility frontier, which again is a very simple model of an economy that produces. Now, all the points on the line represent points that are using up all of our resources and are possible. And so they are feasible and they are efficient in production because we're using all of our resources. But any points inside the production possibility frontier are points that, even though they represent a combination of the two goods that can be produced, so they are feasible, they are inefficient in production because given the resources that we have, we could be producing more of either good. So at point C, we're producing 9 Dreamliners and 20 small jets, but we could be producing 20 small jets and 15 Dreamliners, or 9 Dreamliners and 28 small jets. So, because we aren't using all of our resources, we are not being efficient in production. So that's what the points inside the production possibility frontier represent. Yes.
So any correct me if I'm wrong, any point on the actual slope itself is efficient, regardless of what they're reallocating or what resources they reallocate.
Yeah. Right, because we're not thinking about like that extra dimension of complexity where you think about like increasing opportunity costs. So in that case, it would have like a rounded edge to the production possibility frontier. But if it's just a line, that doesn't apply, and it's just a constant opportunity cost. Yes.
Be efficient in production, but not allocation.
Right. So in order for the entire economy to be efficient, it has to be efficient in production and allocation, which means that people are getting the things they want. We're not just using everything we have to produce. We're also producing the things that people want. But this model doesn't take that into consideration. If we include a point of consumption, it's just based on an assumption that we're making, not on anything that the model would result in. Anyway, so that's the production possibility frontier. And this would be the increasing opportunity cost. I forgot I had that in there, but there it is. We have increasing opportunity costs. Initially, to create this many small jets, we're giving up just 5 Dreamliners, but as we try to use all of our resources to produce all small jets, so the next 20 requires us to give up 25 Dreamliners. So the opportunity cost is increasing when it's bowed out. Anyway, so that's that. Let's do a quick one dealing with supply and demand shifts. So we're going to explain and graph the effect of the following developments on equilibrium price and quantity in the market for steak. So in the practice problem that I have in the practice exam, I don't ask you to draw anything, but I could potentially ask you to draw the market model. So that's something that you should be aware of, because you should always be capable of drawing graphs, being able to label the axes, being able to label the curves. If something's changing, being able to clearly label that as well. Like these are things that are going to help you to communicate regardless of the discipline you wind up in. So it's good to practice that. So I might ask you to draw graphs, be it these or others. It's always on the table. All right, so in this case, you're being asked to explain and graph the effect of the following developments on equilibrium price and quantity in the market for steak. So we're working in the market for steak. So here we're being told the price of chicken, a substitute for steak, has fallen. In terms of the market for steak, is that going to affect the demand or the supply side? It's going to affect the demand side, right? That's one of the things that will shift the demand relationship, the price of related goods, which can be substitutes or complements. So a substitute, again, is a good where if the price goes up of your good, then the quantity demanded will go up of the other good. People will substitute away from it to the other one. And for complements, they're bought together. So we're talking about peanut butter and jelly, let's say. If the price of peanut butter goes up, then at any given price in the jelly market, people will demand less, so demand will go down in that market. All right, so here we're talking about the price of chicken, a substitute for steak. It falls. So what's going to happen in the market for steak? So we said that it's going to affect the demand side. What's going to happen to demand? So this is a substitute, and the price has fallen. So yes, indeed, the demand will decrease because now the substitute is cheaper, right? So people are going to substitute away from steak to chicken at any given price. Folks are going to demand less, which means the demand curve will shift to the left. And so demand will decrease. So my clicker's been getting ahead of me these days. Got to replace the clicker, apparently. All right, anyway, so the price of chicken. All right, so here we go. The market for steak, it's an equilibrium. Here's a upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve. They meet in the middle where there's an equilibrium price. Price is on the y-axis, quantity is on the x-axis. We got an equilibrium price, we've got an equilibrium quantity. All of a sudden, the price of chicken has fallen. That means at any given price, folks are going to demand less steak. And so then the demand curve is going to shift to the left. What's going to happen to equilibrium price? It's going to go down, right? It's going to decrease. What's going to happen to equilibrium quantity? It's going to decrease as well, right? So we see that the equilibrium price has gone down at this new intersection. and we see that the equilibrium quantity has gone down as well. What's happened to supply? Has it stayed the same? The supply curve hasn't shifted, but something has happened. Quantity supplied decreased, right? So remember, when we're talking about a movement along a curve, we're talking about a quantity supply or quantity demand change versus a shift of the curve, which was an increase or decrease of demand or supply, whatever's happening. Yeah. The for no, because the fact that the substitute price has gone down has caused demand to decrease and shift to the left. So demand has decreased. But what that caused in terms of the supply side is we just moved along the supply curve down. So quantity supplied went down. So now we are at a lower equilibrium quantity and price. Clear? Okay. All right. B, due to a severe drought, the price of corn feed for cattle increases. So first of all, is this going to affect supply or demand? Supply, right? So put yourself in the shoes of a supplier. You are supplying steak and you're feeding your cows, and all of a sudden the feed for your cows is more expensive, right? So at any given price, what's going to happen to your supply? You're going to supply less, right? So what's going to happen to supply? Supply decreases, right? So in the market for steak, supply will decrease, so the curve will shift to the left. What's going to happen to equilibrium price? Equilibrium price. It just goes up, right? And equilibrium quantity, this goes down, right? So we're just talking about this new intersection here of the two curves, this new equilibrium. Equilibrium price has increased, equilibrium quantity has decreased. And because we've moved up along the demand curve, how do we describe that? An increase in quantity demanded. I'm sorry, a decrease in quantity demanded because we're moving in that direction. I apologize for that. But the fact that we moved along it is a decrease in quantity demanded. So now at this new equilibrium, the quantity demanded has decreased. It's all about being able to describe what's happening precisely. And that's why you have to know the distinction between the two ways of describing these things. All right, finally, the technology for steak production improves. At the same time, consumer incomes rise. Assume that steak is a normal good. So first of all, with a normal good, if incomes rise, what happens to the demand? It increases, right? It moves in the same direction. A normal good is just a good that people buy more of when their incomes go up. All right, so we've got two different effects. The first effect is that the technology for steak production has improved. Is that affecting supply or demand? All right, it's improved. You're a supplier. You can produce better now. So at any given price, what are you going to do? You're going to supply more, right? So supply will increase. All right. Assuming that steak is a normal good, at the same time, consumer incomes rise. At any given price, what does that mean for demand? It will increase, right? People will buy more at any given price. All right, so here is the original equilibrium for the market. Again, equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. When technology for steak production improves, suppliers will supply more steak at any given price. That means the supply increases and shifts to the right. And then when consumer incomes rise and a good is normal, at any given price, consumers will demand more, which means that demand will increase or shift to the right as well. Now, what happens to equilibrium quantity here? Equilibrium quantity will increase. What happens to equilibrium price? Barely changes based on what we've done. Now, remember, when you're dealing with individual shifts of the curves, there's always going to be a clear-cut result with respect to price and quantity, how they're going to move. But when you're talking about two shifts of a curve, then one of the variables, what's going to happen to them, is going to be unclear, and that's going to be totally based on how much you shift the curves. So remember, I shifted the curves just arbitrarily. I just chose to shift them slightly to the right, however much I did. And nobody told me to do that. Like it didn't say like shift it, half an inch or whatever. Like, so I just chose to do that, and that resulted in what we got here, which is an equilibrium rise in the quantity, and in this case, a slight decrease in the equilibrium price. But let's say that I had shifted the demand curve just a little bit more. You can see by shifting the demand curve just a little bit more to the right that the equilibrium price actually goes up instead of down. And so what does that tell us about the effect of these two shifts on equilibrium price? It's ambiguous, right? It's unclear. We don't know what's going to happen to price. We know for sure because we know for sure what's going to happen to equilibrium quantity because here I shifted demand a little bit to the right and equilibrium quantity increased. And still, even when I increased how much I shifted the demand curve, equilibrium quantity still increased. So that is a clear-cut effect as far as what happens to equilibrium price. Because it's moved either up or down depending on how much I shifted the curve, the result is ambiguous. And that's the answer you would give. The effect on price would be ambiguous. All right, another quick multiple choice on PPF shifts. So which of the following will not shift out the production possibility frontier? A, an improvement of the technology level of the economy. B, an increase in the workforce of the economy. C, a change in the preference of the consumers of the economy to consume more of one good. Or D, an increase in the amount of capital in the economy. How many of you think it's A? How many of you think it's B? How many of you think it's C? How many of you think it's D? How many of you don't care? Apparently more than the people that got the right answer. But anyway, if you raised your hand for C, then indeed you are correct. That is the one thing that will not shift out the production possibility frontier. So remember, the production possibility frontier illustrates the trade-offs facing an economy that produces only two goods, and it shows the maximum quantity of one good that can be produced for any given quantity produced of the other good, given, and these are the keys, the existing resources and the existing technology. So if the resources change, so if the amount of people you have that can work increases, that will shift the amount you can produce out. If your technology increases as far as like your ability to produce more over any increment of time, then that will also shift the production possibility frontier out. So a change in preference of the consumers of the economy to consume more of one good has everything to do with like consumption and allocation of consumption goods, which has nothing to do with the production possibility frontier. All right, let's do one more with respect to changes in the market for bicycles. So how will the market for bicycles be affected by an increase in the price of gasoline and an increase in the desire for exercise? Yeah. An increase in the amount of capital in the economy. So remember, capital is one of the inputs into production. So it's just what economists call like the machines and the buildings. So if you are increasing that, then that will shift out your production possibility frontier. You will be able to produce more of both goods. All right, changes in the market for bicycles. Last one, I'm pretty sure. How will the market for bicycles be affected by an increase in the price of gasoline and an increase in the desire for exercise? All right, so let's think about these in turn. Our options are the equilibrium price and quantity of bicycles will increase. Second, the equilibrium price of bicycles will fall and the equilibrium quantity will increase. Third, the equilibrium price of bicycles will rise, but we do not have enough information to determine the change in equilibrium quantity. Or the equilibrium quantity of bicycles will rise, but we do not have enough information to determine the change in equilibrium price. All right, so let's consider these effects in turn. First, you want to ask yourself, what is changing, demand, supply, or both? So as far as like an increase in the price of gasoline, and we're talking about the market for bicycles, is that going to affect demand or supply? Just think very simply, don't complicate it. It's going to affect demand, right? Like you are a person who drives a car and all of a sudden it's more expensive for you to drive. So what is driving with respect to bicycles? How are they related? They're transportation, so they're substitutes, right? So if the price of one goes up, then you substitute away from it to the other and you consume more of it, right? So if the price of gasoline goes up, then you substitute away from driving to riding your bicycle. So what's going to happen to demand for bicycles? It's going to increase, right? Demand for bicycles will increase. All right, so that's what we just covered. So as far as our market for bicycles, you've got a downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve. There's our equilibrium. Increasing the price of a substitute will increase demand, which means that the demand curve will shift to the right. And just based on that effect, equilibrium price will go up and equilibrium quantity will go up as well. All right, so let's talk about an increase in the desire for exercise. Is that going to affect demand or supply? Okay. In the desire for exercise. Demand, right? What is that that's being affected? It's desires, it's tastes. It's like how people feel about the product in general in our society, you know? So in our society over the last few decades, in fact, people have changed their attitude towards exercise. So as far as demand for bicycles, what has that done? Increased demand for bicycles. So again, we're going to get the same effect. Both of them are going to increase the demand for bicycles, which means that, again, that is going to increase demand. So it's just going to shift the demand curve more to the right. So therefore, what is the answer to this problem? Right? Equilibrium price and quantity will both increase. All right. So there you go. There's a few examples for you to just kind of get you thinking about how you should be thinking about, like, the couple of models that we've covered so far. Now we are going to jump into the first part of Chapter 6, Macroeconomics, the Big Picture. So it's time to shift gears mentally from like the smaller stuff to the bigger stuff. So we'll go until 8:10, and then we'll take a break, and we'll come back and we'll go till 9:45, or however long. It might be shorter. Probably not today. All right, so macroeconomics, the big picture, what we'll learn in this chapter, chapter 6. What makes macroeconomics different from microeconomics? So we'll talk a little bit about that. I've talked about it already. So all the stuff that we're going to talk about is not going to be talked about in too much detail because they're very like broad issues that, again, will be fleshed out as we move forward in the semester. All right, the second question, what a business cycle is, and why policymakers seek to diminish the severity of the business cycle. So that's another thing that we're going to deal with in this class and introduce in this chapter. The meaning of inflation and deflation and why price stability is preferred. We'll talk about the importance of open economy macroeconomics. And open economy has to do with an economy that is interacting with the rest of the world economically via trade, via exchange of currencies, and how economies interact through trade deficits and trade surpluses. All right, so those are the topics we'll talk about. Let's first talk about the nature of macro. So let's talk about macroeconomic questions that are addressed within this discipline. So the distinguishing feature of macroeconomics is that it focuses on the behavior of the economy as a whole. So microeconomic questions might involve a question like, should I go to business school or should I take a job right now? So an individual might decide, whether to do one thing or something else. And in micro, we'll like model that decision. We'll say, well, there's a certain amount of utility they might get, happiness, satisfaction from one option versus another. They have a certain set of preferences that'll lead a person to choose one or the other. And ultimately, the choice will depend on marginal analysis. Whether marginal benefit and marginal costs allow for one option versus another. Now, in macro, we might talk about how many people are employed in the economy as a whole in a given year. So again, an individual in micro and everybody in macro. Another microeconomic question, what determines the salary offered by Citibank to Cherry Kamaho, a new MBA? So just again, like a very specific question, how do you set a price of an input into production versus what determines the overall salary levels paid to workers in a given year? So If we're talking about wages in the economy as a whole, that's a macro question. Another micro question: what determines the cost to a university or college of offering a new course? So they want to figure out, can we offer a new course? Well, we've got to weigh the cost versus the benefit. And in macro, we can figure out questions like, what determines the overall level of prices in the economy as a whole versus the price of like one thing that a firm in the economy or an institution might be considering. All right, another micro question: what government policies should be adopted to make it easier for low-income students to attend college? So again, that situation deals specifically with a decision to either go to college or not, and so then you would do an analysis of like, what are their costs, and then you would think, okay, well, what can the government do, and then what are their costs? And it's a very specific question to a very specific group of people within the economy. It's slightly larger than just an individual, but still we're talking about like the education of certain people, which is not everybody. It's not the entire economy. A macro question could be something like, what government policies should be adopted to promote employment and growth in the economy as a whole? Another micro question: what determines whether Citibank opens a new office in Shanghai? Again, cost-benefit analysis would answer that very small question. Macro question: what determines the overall trade in goods and services and financial assets between the U.S. and the rest of the world? So again, macro questions dealing with the overall interaction of economies, which is like really interesting, by the way. Like just probably the most interesting area of economics that one can study today, because the world is more interconnected today than it's ever been before, post the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s, and that sort of started this trend toward everybody sort of becoming like these like market economies versus the command economies that they were, where the government was deciding what to produce and who was going to consume what. Now that ended, and there's no superpowers that have that kind of approach. You still see that in like countries like North Korea, but that's more of like totalitarian state. But you'll see characteristics of that kind of economy throughout the world in small parts. Maybe the biggest player would be China. China, as I've mentioned before, likely they were communist, and they've never officially changed from being communist, but now they sort of call themselves socialist with Chinese characteristics, which is like this weird hybrid of like an authoritarian like communist state with a free market economy. It works really weird, but in the end, it is sort of just another kind of like Western market economy, where like the economy is kind of in some large part, like kind of managing itself. Anyway, like all the big players in the world kind of have this very specific type of economy now. And so there isn't like this major ideological battle that was going on between like, countries that were led by like the Soviet Union post World War II, because the Soviet Union and the U.S. were essentially like the big players that helped to end World War II. And so post that time period, we divided up Germany into East and West Germany, and then kind of the rest of the world. And we always had like this ideological difference between us as far as like how the economy should be run and how much of a role the government should be playing in the economy. And that led to what you've heard of to be the Cold War, which was like a war of ideas that was never explicitly fought, on like battlefields with soldiers, right? Like, so it wasn't like a hot war. It was a cold war. The conflict existed, and whenever there were little conflicts going on, like we both big sides kind of had a part in it. So you think about Vietnam, you think about Korea. Both of us were involved in those skirmishes, but not directly often. It was just like kind of, maybe like we were involved in Vietnam, but like maybe they were funding like the other side, and it wasn't clear, so we weren't directly at war with the Soviet Union. Anyway, this whole Cold War thing and this battle of ideologies kind of kept the world not as connected as it could be economically. And then post 1990, that's when things changed dramatically. And now we're at the point where we're more connected than we've ever been before. And the digital age, of course, has helped that along. And so now we're at a point in time where we've never been before in the world. And that's why it's such an interesting area. Dealing with studying sort of open economy macroeconomics, because again, there's still frontiers to be conquered there. There's still conflicts that can still be resolved that would help us to even improve like the state of like our interconnectedness, which would again wind up benefiting us, and ultimately not just benefiting us in terms of like how much we can consume and how much we can produce, but also like are people being taken care of, like are the policies in the countries that are now trading with like Western countries, are they also being mindful of like human rights? Are they being mindful of like the environment? So there's definitely a lot of progress that needs to be made there still. There's a lot of issues that are yet to be resolved, but again, it's an exciting frontier even to this day, and there's just a lot of work to be done. So if you are interested in going into an arena in life that can be ultimately exciting, even though what you may actively be doing yourself within it might be kind of dry, then that is definitely like a path that's worth taking, like just kind of dealing with like international trade or international economics of some sort. So, and again, like that's something we'll cover explicitly at the end of the course. But the point of this whole little spiel is like that the world is at a point today that it has not been in the past, and so studying macroeconomics will help you to sort of elucidate that, like kind of bring that to light for you. Hopefully, create as much interest in it as I have. All right, so let's talk about macroeconomics. Again, we're talking about the nature of it. So the whole is greater than the sum of the parts is the point of this small section. So understanding a rubbernecking traffic jam gives us some insights into one very important way in which macroeconomics is different from microeconomics. So many thousands or millions of individual actions tend to compound upon one another to produce an outcome that isn't simply the sum of those individual actions. So individual actions can then can result in something that's much bigger than was ever intended by those individual actions. So an example of this is what's called the paradox of thrift. So when families and businesses are worried about the possibility of economic hard times, they prepare by cutting their spending. So in 2008, when all the craziness was happening and the banks were almost going under, people started pulling back on their spending because they knew that they could potentially be losing their jobs, or their companies that won't be generating as much revenue as they did before because people won't be buying as much, etc. So this reduction in spending actually winds up depressing the economy as consumers spend less and businesses react by laying off workers. So that's where the compounding effect comes in. So the economy is already going to go into a slump, and the fact that people are afraid of that is partly what makes the economy go into a slump. So as a result, families and businesses may end up worse off than if they hadn't tried to act responsibly by cutting their spending. So preparing for hard times ends up hurting everybody. So that's the paradox of thrift, and that's just an example of how the effects of the sum of individual actions can be bigger than the parts. All right, macroeconomics theory and policy. So to a much greater extent than microeconomics, macroeconomics are concerned with questions about policy. So again, we are a social science. We are about analysis. We are about positive questions, which again have to do with just like analyzing what's happening and just observing and sort of giving a description of that, maybe forecasting, trying to predict what's going to happen based on what we know. But it's not about like giving normative prescriptions that basically say, well, it is good for us to spend a lot of money in this area, or it is bad that we are not spending enough money in this area. So like that sort of assertion of a value judgment is something we try to stay away from. That's the arena of politics. But obviously, economics and politics interact. And so we do help policymakers to make informed decisions. And in the macro arena, it's a lot more significant than in the micro arena, because ultimately, the macroeconomy is one of the main arenas of politicians, right? Like the macroeconomy is sort of like what they're trying to manage themselves, because it affects everybody. And then if people aren't happy, if the economy is not doing well, then they're not doing well as politicians. So it's super important for politicians to, just have people informing them on the economy. All right, so you can have questions like, what can the government do to make macroeconomic performance better? So the focus resulted from the Great Depression of the 1930s. So this focus on policy that comes from the macro field started after the Great Depression. So that's actually when macroeconomics was developed as a discipline. So I mentioned how microeconomics was developed as a formal discipline back in the 1800s when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and that basically broke down how individual markets operate, and describing all these things that led to the development of the micro discipline. It wasn't until the 30s that we were able to establish like the theory that underlies and encompasses and defines macroeconomics. So pre-1930s, the conventional wisdom was that we have a self-regulating economy. So problems such as unemployment are resolved without government intervention through the workings of the invisible hand. So this approach that Adam Smith developed was taken to be the approach that we should have for the entire economy, not just like small markets. And so, again, if you had problems in the economy, you were supposed to just kind of let it work itself out. And obviously that led to a disaster, which was the Great Depression, which was a result of this great stock market crash that occurred in 1929. So post 1930s, we had the conventional wisdom, the standard sort of wisdom about how the economy should be approached with respect to policy changed. And the thing that did it was what's called Keynesian economics, named after the guy that developed macroeconomics, John Maynard Keynes, which I'll talk about in a second. So economic slumps are caused by inadequate spending based on this view, and they can be mitigated by government intervention. So before the 1930s, the view was let the economy do its own thing. Post 1930s, with the Great Depression, it became obvious we need to actively be working with the economy to either accelerate it or cool it off by the government playing an active role in buying and selling within it. All right, so this dude, John Maynard Keynes, that you see on this Time magazine cover, is a British economist. He published this book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. That, again, is the book that developed the discipline. So if you actually read the book, you'll see everything that you'll see in our book in that book, just described in words, mainly. Sure, of course. Got it? All right. All right, so Keynes argued that government intervention can help a depressed economy through monetary policy and fiscal policy. So again, before we had the self-regulating economy view, Keynes came in and said, no, we can't do that because look how terrible things are right now with the Great Depression that affected the US, that affected Great Britain, Europe nations, just all the Western powers were affected by this. And so Keynes argued, no, we have to be either taxing and use our taxing and spending policies, which is fiscal policy, to try to heat up the economy, or we have to try to do it through monetary policy, which deals specifically with expanding and contracting the money supply. So again, money supply uses changes in the quantity of money to alter interest rates and affect overall spending. So changing the money supply will either increase or decrease the interest rate. The interest rate is considered the opportunity cost of holding cash. So if you have a dollar, you could keep that dollar in your pocket, and that's all it'll ever be. But you could also invest it, and let's say even just invest it in like a savings account, right? You put it in a savings account and you get some interest rates, you get some return on it. So if you don't have that dollar invested, then you're passing up that interest you could be getting. And so therefore, like, again, in economics, when we talk about cost, we talk about opportunity cost, which is the value of everything you're passing up. And so the interest rate winds up being like this huge sort of like opportunity cost signal in the economy. So as interest rates go up, people then don't want to hold money. They want to invest it. As interest rates go down, then they want to hold money. And so contracting and expanding the money supply then helps to affect that behavior, which then either helps to heat up or cool off the economy. And we'll talk very specifically about this in a chapter dedicated specifically to monetary policy when we get to the end of the course. Yes. Okay, so you're complicating things. Let's not talk about negative interest rates right now, because that is a very interesting issue that we'll talk about when we get to monetary policy. All right, fiscal policy, again, the other policy tool that the government can use to try to heat up or cool off the economy, has to do with taxing and spending. So again, formally, it uses changes in government spending and taxes to affect the overall spending in the economy. So Keynes established the idea that managing the economy is a government responsibility. So again, before this time period, before Keynes, it was very controversial to even talk about these things and say, yeah, the government should be doing these things. But the Great Depression was a very clear evidence that like we were doing something wrong. And again, like just coming to the present, to 2008, had we not done anything with respect to injecting money into the economy, bailing out the banks the way we did, we would have gone into another Great Depression, and we may still be experiencing effects from that today had we not intervened. Yes. Okay, that's something we'll talk about when we get to monetary policy. It's a complicated process that I can't describe in a few sentences. If you're interested, you can go forward and read the chapter and figure it out. But I will explain it later in the course. Yeah. All right, so let's quickly just compare the Great Recession to the Great Depression and demonstrate how, this new perspective on the interaction of the government in the economy has affected, the way that the economy has functioned. So here we're talking about a measure of industrial output, so everything that the economy is producing. So that's on the y-axis, and then months since the peak in output. So that means that 3 months after the peak, we were going down. So basically, at these points, both of these starting points here represent the points at which the economy started to go into a downturn as a result of these big events. In 1929, the stock market crash. In 2008, the banking crisis. So we see that the industrial output started to go down significantly for quite a long time. So we're talking about nearly 4 years here. So 1929 to 1933, around the time that Keynes's ideas first started to be implemented actively by the government. And then we started having an increase there. Here is the Great Recession of 2008. There was a slump, but we managed to bounce back pretty quickly based on the intervention that we actively engaged in via our government policies. So there was a big difference in how the economy could have gone had we not intervened. All right, now let's talk about this thing called the business cycle. We'll take a break in 5 minutes. So we'll talk about charting the business cycle. So the common movement of employment and production is the starting point for a major theme in macroeconomics, the economy's alteration between short-run downturns and upturns. So again, when we're talking about the business cycle, we're talking about a short-run phenomenon. We're not talking about like long-term ability of the economy to produce. We're talking about like what's happening immediately. Is it going down? Is it going up? What do we need to do to kind of mitigate that, make that better so that we're not fluctuating so much? So this is just a sample sort of way that the economy could move. So we could have employment or production as a measure of how well the economy is working. And over here, it is a function of time. So there's certain years that the economy will go through, and it'll either go up or down with respect to how much people are employed or how much is being produced, which again, both of them are good measures of how well the economy is doing. So if the economy is going down as far as what it can produce, what it's producing in a given interval of time, or how many people are employed, then we say that the economy is going into a recession. So a recession, which again is a contraction, is a period of economic downturn when output and employment are falling. When the economy starts to bounce back or increase the amount of output or employment, we say that the economy is in an expansion. So this period here can be considered an expansion. As you see here, it is labeled that. So the business cycle is just this overall sort of pattern, the short-run alteration between recessions and expansions. The economy going up and down in the immediate time period is the business cycle. Sometimes it's expanding and it gets to some peak, and then it gets into a recession, and then it gets into a trough, which is what we term the bottom of the business cycle, and then at some point it starts to bounce back, so it starts to expand again, and it happens all over again. That's why it's a cycle, because it keeps repeating. Is there a question? Say that one more time. Say that one more time. Does what cycle for recessions? Oh, do we have cycles for recessions? Okay, so the recessions are part of the overall business cycle. So you can have like periods of time in which the economy might be going up a little bit during a recession, but as long as the trend is negative, you can call that a recession. So we have a very formal way of defining what that looks like, even though you might have like it going up slightly. Like if it's going down over like 3 periods, which I'll cover in a second, then you can just consider that a recession and not think about it as having its own cycle. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I get what you're saying. You're saying, is there like a pattern for when recessions occur? Well, it depends on the policies that are being implemented. It depends on what's happening in the economy. That's one of the big issues here, which is like, can we predict what's happening? And people want to say they can predict it. And you might have like people on Wikipedia saying, yes, well, there is a consensus that says that every 10 years there'll be a recession. But in reality, that's not true. In reality, like, you can stave off a recession for even longer than that. And it has a lot to do with policies. It has a lot to do with the stability of the financial sector. It has a lot to do with like international trade pacts and movements in the international economy. So your own economy could be fine, but if something is going on like in Britain where you have this Brexit thing, then that will affect your economy. So it's just, and if Donald Trump is elected here, then that'll affect the rest of the world because he might affect our connections economically to them, and that's uncertain. So you just can't say for sure, and that's ultimately the answer. Like, you cannot say for sure. Let me just finish this section, then we'll go on a break. You've got business cycles. Dude, this thing is out of control. All right. Actually, you know what? Let's just take a break right now. We got another one of these. Let's just take a break and we'll come back. Let's come back at 8:30. 8:30, we'll come back.